Hi there. In the last video we added specs for the index controller action. So now we can continue to write tests for the other controller actions. If you remember, we previously added the index action, which is now tested, and we also have a create and a destroy action. So if I jump back over to the spec, we can first of all, let's enclose this test here in its own describe block. So the reason for doing that would be we want to separate the different tests for the index action, create and destroy action. So I can say describe. I'll open a do block here and I'll just move the test up into there. And in this describe, I can say get books. So now that means we can have another describe block for the create. Let me just open up the books controller again. Books controller. Yeah, so we have a create. So this would be post books. And if we want to check why that's post books, I can just check the roots. RKR for me is just an alias for rake roots. And if we have a look, we can see that the create action here is should be accessed via post, and the endpoint is books. So that's correct. Oops. And in here we'll also have an it block similar to the one above, only this would be, instead of returning books, this would create a new book. And we'll close that off. For this test, instead of doing the get, we do post to /API v1 books. And then we need to also provide some params. So we use the params keyword, and then we can provide a hash of param arguments. So I'll just have book. And also if you remember, we need to provide the params nested under book. So the structure would be book, and then we have the book attributes, title and author nested under there. So it's title and author. So for the title of this book, let's say The Martian by Andy Weir. There we go. And I should be able to execute this test if I've written it correctly. There we go. So that passes, although we don't have any assertions yet. But I can say expect the response to have HTTP status of created. If you remember, in the create, we return the status created if the API call works successfully. So let's run that. And it's still green, which is great. So we've tested the response code, but we haven't actually tested that the book was created. And in order to do that, we can use, RSpec has a method which allows you to check whether the database count changes. So it looks something like expect. We need to use curly braces for a block here. So we say expect to change, and then we have another block with the book count. That's an active record method for checking basically the number of rows in the database. So expect the book count to change from 0 to 1. So what this is saying is before we call this, before we make the post request, there should be 0 books in the database. After we make the post request, there should be 1, because this book would have been created. So let's run that now. There we go, that passes. Next we have the destroy controller that we need to test. So first step, as before, is to wrap this in a describe block. So this would be a delete request to books, but we want to delete a specific book. So if I check the roots again, you see we have books and then the ID of the specific book that we want to delete. So that's an ID. By the way, these describe blocks are just strings. They don't actually affect the test. It's just good to have them sort of labeled correctly. So we say it deletes a book, and this would be delete API v1 books. And then we also want an ID on the end of that. So for now, let's just hardcode the ID to 1. And then we would expect the response to have HTTP status of, let's check that, no content. There we go. So let's run this test. And you can see we get a failure because it says active record not found, could not find book at ID 1. So that makes sense because we haven't actually done any test setup to create that book. If you remember, up in the index test, we used FactoryBot to create some dummy records in the database. So we can do the same thing here. So I'll grab that factory, add it in here, rerun the test. And there we have a passing test. In fact, if I run the whole test suite now, we should see that all the tests pass, which is great. It gives us, a good confidence that our API is working. Now there's still some improvements we can make to these tests. The first one is it's not great to hardcode this ID, because if this test starts to get a bit more complicated, if someone was to come along and add logic to it, that could break in the future. What we really want to do is specifically identify this record. So what I can do here is assign this to book, and then I can use the string interpolation, which only works if you have a double quotes, and I can say book ID. That should still pass. There we go. And I can take this a step further. RSpec has the concept of lets, which are basically allow you to define variables outside of the it block, and they're great because they allow you to keep the actual test implementation as small as possible, and it makes them a lot easier to read. So what I can do is move this up here. You can see now the actual test expectation is back down to 2 lines. And then I can say let book, and then I use a block to define the expression that we're evaluating. So this is essentially just creating the factory and then assigning it to book. And I can run this test, and that passes. The other thing I've just noticed is we are testing the status code response, but we haven't actually checked to make sure that the database record gets deleted, just like we've done here in the post test. We basically want to do the inverse in the delete test. So we can say expect, move that up into the block, to change book count from 0 to 1. Oops, and this would be the opposite way around, so it would be from 1 to 0. So the idea is you have a book in the database and we call the delete request, and then we should have no books in the database. So let's run the test. Okay, so we get a failure. Now, the reason this fails is because the let is lazy loaded. Basically what that means is this doesn't get called when the test initially starts running. It only gets called when we call book. So what I can do is I can add a bang, and that means that when the test first starts, the factory gets created, and that means that when the test starts, there is one book in the database. So let me run that again. There we go, that passes. So I think we're nearly done here. The last thing we could do is do some tidy up on our original index test, because we have this nice small test, but then here we've got some setup here which could be moved out of the test to bring this back down to just 3 lines. So what I can do in this case is I don't really need to use lets, because we don't care about we don't need to sort of assign them to a variable to use that variable later on. So for that I can use a before block. And this is basically some code which gets run before. So this code will get run before every test inside this describe. Now right now I only have 1, but if we were to add more in the future, this code would get executed before each one. And I'll run that just to see if it still passes. It does. I'll run the whole test suite. And that still passes. So there we go. Now we've got the books controller fully tested, ready for adding some new functionality in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.